Hello everyone, welcome to the Green Man channel for another ranking video. In today's video I'm going to be ranking the studio albums of the band Sylosis, whose t-shirt I'm wearing for this special occasion. Sylosis were formed in 2000 by the guitarist Josh Middleton and bassist Carl Parnell. So this is therefore had about a 20-21 year time span in their career, and during which time they've released 2 EPs and 5 studio albums. It's obviously the studio albums that I'll be ranking from my least favourite to my favourite in this video. Now, Sylosis, broadly referred to as a thrash metal band, but for me they're more than just a thrash metal band. They have a lot of melodic passages within and between their thrashy phrases or thrashy rhythms. And they also, I think, incorporate a bit of metalcore. There's progressive elements to their music. In fact, some of their albums almost play out as prog metal albums because they're quite lengthy and they have quite lengthy songs. And I think they are just overall really interesting, really quite dynamic metal band that don't get mentioned often enough for my liking. I think they're very underrated. So much so, I just want to say that, Cycle of Suffering, the album from last year, I was very surprised that wasn't on more album of the year lists. I will come onto that a bit later. It did make it onto my album of the year list, of course, if you watched that. It was my first ever video on this channel. And it was that Cycle of Suffering came third in that video. So, I'm going to crack on now with my choices from my least favourite Sylosis album to my favourite. And my least favourite Sylosis album is Conclusion of an Age, their debut album. And this one for me was it felt like the slightly more metalcore album. Still, some quite long tracks on here, some really quite interesting riffs going on. One of my favourite ever Sylosis tracks is on here, which is Transcendence. I think that has an absolutely gorgeous ending to it. And After Lifeless Years, the single, I really enjoyed that one. And there's a lot, as with all the Sylosis albums, there's quite a lot to digest. You can listen to this album, quite a few times and just not tire of it. They're another very consistent band, I think. So Conclusion Age comes, I think it's my least favourite because I felt like in the middle of the album, for me, it just dragged just a touch. And it wasn't until right at the end of the album again, I thought that it sort of picked up, more of my interest. It's the one I probably go back to the least as well, even though there are 2 or 3 tracks I adore. I think I go back to Conclusion of an Age the least of all the Sylosis albums. So what's next? Number 4 is Monolith, and this was a really difficult one for me because 4 and 3 are so close together in this race. Could have been a tie, to be honest, but Monolith was 4th. Even though this is a pretty epic album, right? It's got great songs on it most of the way through. For me, this just outstayed its welcome a tiny bit. I thought there was just a few too many kind of long tracks that didn't need to be super long, especially that one at the end, of course, with the long gap in the middle before the track comes back with kind of another part of the song. I think that's the closing track on this album, which I just found an interesting choice. And I know some bands do that sort of, but I mean, it kind of, for me, made this album very lengthy. I thought that, between this one and my next choice, the next one just that tiny bit more interesting, and I've gone back to it a lot more. And that choice is, of course, Dormant Heart. That's my number 3. And it was the first album that really got me into Sylosis, to be truthful. I didn't know much of their stuff before I listened to Dormant Heart. And Dormant Heart, I think, has a beautiful flow to it. It starts off kind of atmospheric as a bit of a slow burner. And this is where I think that Sylosis show that they kind of transitioned a lot into this more progressive metal band, almost. And, the songs, some good lyrics going on here, good songwriting. I really enjoy tracks like Harm with those amazing guitar harmonies towards the end. You've got Leech with a beautiful solo. You've got Dormant Heart, the title track, and those pretty cool atmospheric opening tracks. I just like how this album stands apart from the other albums as being that bit different from the others, and I really like Dormant Heart for that reason. It's kind of like slightly the odd one out, but I really love it for that reason. So Dormant Heart comes in as my 3rd favourite. So number 2 is the album I mentioned right at the beginning of this video, which I tried not to, hopefully didn't spoil the video too much, but you could probably guess it was going to be high up. and it comes at number 2. That's Cycle of Suffering from last year, from that lovely year that was 2020. But Cycle of Suffering was definitely a highlight for me, and as I say, I think it was criminal. On lots of lists and lots of YouTubers that I enjoy watching, I don't think any of them listed Cycle of Suffering in their top 10, 20, 30 albums, and I was really disappointed about that. Sylosis Cycle of Suffering is an amazing album for me. It's like all the best of Sylosis but packed into a 45-minute, 50-minute runtime album, and for me that works incredibly well. I think the only sort of drawbacks of some of the other Sylosis albums is that they're a bit lengthy, and this was like Sylosis packing all their strengths, all their kind of riffs and dynamic changes, all packed into that runtime, that 50 minutes. And it's a hugely effective album for that reason, I think. Definitely one of their faster, more up-tempo albums, but they still managed to retain that Sylosis sound, and those other elements, those more ambient, atmospheric elements are still there, which still make their music kind of brutal and yet pretty nice and melodic at the same time. That balance that I think Sylosis achieved very, very well within the thrash genre. I can't think of that many bands that sort of have a sound quite like that fuses that melody quite so well with really brutal thrash passages. So Cycle of Suffering comes number 2. I mean, the closing on track on this one I think is really quite emotional, actually. It kind of moves me. Abandon. There's lots of other good tracks on Cycle of Suffering, including the title track, Empty Prophets. I liked Calcified, which was one of the singles. Idle Hands, Invidia, beautiful, two gorgeous tracks in the middle of the album. Apex of Disdain, Arms Like a Noose, Devils in Their Eyes, the slightly more heavier ones. This is a great album. It really is, and it deserves more mentions on the tongues of the metalheads in that metalhead community, because it's just great. My number one choice is the only one left, the only studio album left, and it's none other than the epic, I think it's kind of their masterpiece, and that's Edge of the Earth. Edge of the Earth, it's over an hour long, and whilst I was a bit critical of the length of Sylosis albums, this one just has so much in that time, I think, that is really interesting. All the tracks on here are pretty epic tracks. There are so many here to choose from the Opener Procession to more kind of really cool tracks like Altered States of Consciousness. From the Edge of the Earth, that track is just beyond awesome. It's exceptional. It really is. Perhaps that one is my favourite, all-time favourite rather, Sylosis track from the Edge of the Earth. It is something to behold. I thoroughly recommend that, if you're just starting on Sylosis, perhaps Cycle of Suffering would be quite a good starting point, but make sure you listen to Edge of the Earth. It is my favourite Sylosis album, and I think if you are partial to thrash, to melodic death, maybe even to metalcore, I think you really enjoy Sylosis and their work. As I say, I hope we get more from this band. I know Josh is working a lot more with Architects now, but I think Sylosis are too underrated. Too underrated. Thanks very much again, everybody, for popping by the channel. If you've been watching this video, as always, feel free to like and subscribe. I will see you, or maybe not, but I hope to see you next time. Take care, everybody.